He had not spoken to another human being in 12 years, and the desert had grown used to his silence. But the night he stepped into the lantern-lit trading yard outside Red Hollow, every man there turned to look at him, as if the wind itself had suddenly learned how to walk. Jack Mercer did not belong in places where voices gathered. For more than a decade his world had been nothing but a weathered cabin, 40 acres of stubborn desert grass, and the slow rhythm of cattle moving beneath a wide Arizona sky. The land sat 30 miles from the nearest town and another 10 from the closest neighbor, a place where dust rolled across the prairie like quiet waves, and the only sound after sunset was the creak of saddle leather cooling beside the door. Folks in Red Hollow used to say Jack Mercer had once been a different man, a man who laughed loud and rode fast, a man who believed life had room for more than work and wind. But that was before the long winter fire that took everything from him and left behind a cowboy who spoke only when a horse needed calming or a calf needed guiding through a gate. Time hardened men in the frontier, yet the desert hardened them differently. It carved silence into their bones. And Jack Mercer carried that silence like a second shadow. That evening he had ridden the 10 miles into town for salt blocks and rifle oil, the kind of supplies a rancher could not ignore no matter how much he preferred solitude. Red Hollow smelled the way small frontier towns always did in early fall. Dust, horses, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of apples brought in from wagons up north. But something felt different that night. Lanterns burned later than usual. Wagons circled the yard behind the trading post. Men stood shoulder to shoulder around a wooden platform, their hats pulled low as if they were watching something they did not quite want to understand. Jack Mercer tied his horse to the hitching rail and stepped closer, boots quiet on the packed dirt. He did not ask questions. Men like him rarely did. But when he reached the edge of the crowd, he saw what held their attention, and the yard grew very still around him. At the center of the platform stood a young Apache woman. Her wrists were loosely bound with rope, though she carried herself as if the rope were nothing more than a suggestion the wind might ignore. Lantern light brushed across her dark hair and the calm strength in her posture. She did not plead with the traders. She did not bow her head the way some captives did when strangers stared too long. Instead, she watched the crowd with quiet eyes that reflected the lantern flames like distant stars. The trader beside her cleared his throat and lifted a small ledger. "Last one," he announced to the gathered men. "Last Apache girl anyone seen for miles." A murmur passed through the crowd. No one stepped forward. Some shifted their boots in the dust. Others looked away entirely. Buying a horse was simple. Buying a wagon was business. But this felt heavier than either of those things. The trader waited a long moment, tapping his pencil against the ledger as the night breeze stirred the lanterns. Then Jack Mercer stepped forward. The crowd parted without a word, recognizing the tall rancher whose silence had become something of a legend along the territory roads. Jack reached into his coat, pulled out a folded stack of bills, and placed them on the trader's table. His voice came out rough from years of disuse, but steady as desert stone. "How much?" The yard fell so quiet that somewhere beyond the fence a single horse snorted in the darkness. The trader blinked in surprise, then slowly counted the money with a crooked smile. The rope around the woman's wrists was cut, and the trader nodded toward Jack Mercer as if the matter were already finished. But as the cowboy turned to leave the platform, something unexpected happened. Instead of tightening the rope again or leading her like a prisoner, Jack simply dropped the loose cord into the dust and walked toward the gate. For a moment the Apache woman did not move. The lantern light flickered across her face as she studied the silent cowboy crossing the yard. Then, without a word, she followed him into the desert night, where the wind carried away the last sound of the crowd, and the long road back to a lonely ranch waited beneath the stars. The road out of Red Hollow stretched 12 quiet miles before the desert finally swallowed every lantern glow behind them. And Jack Mercer rode ahead, without once turning his head, while the Apache woman walked beside his horse with the calm patience of someone who had spent a lifetime crossing wide land without asking permission from anyone. The wind moved slowly across the open country that night, brushing through dry grass and low sage as the moon climbed over the distant ridges. Jack kept his eyes forward, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other holding the reins loosely, while the steady rhythm of the horse filled the silence between them. Most men would have spoken by now. Most men would have tried to explain themselves, or ask questions, or offer some kind of reassurance. But Jack Mercer had forgotten how conversations were supposed to begin. 12 years of living alone had a way of sanding the edges off a man's voice until it felt strange in his own mouth. Back at the ranch, the cabin stood at the edge of a shallow valley surrounded by miles of open range. The place had been built long before Jack owned it, with rough pine beams, a stone chimney, and a porch that leaned slightly toward the west wind. The nearest town sat 30 miles away. The nearest neighbor was even farther. When storms rolled across the desert, they arrived without warning and left just as quickly, and most nights the only light came from the small oil lamp inside Jack's window. He had chosen the place because no one else wanted it. Or maybe because he believed no one else would come looking for him there. The horse slowed as the cabin appeared in the pale moonlight, its shadow stretching across the hard ground like an old memory. Jack dismounted, tied the reins to the rail beside the porch, and stepped toward the door without looking back. For a moment, the Apache woman remained near the gate, studying the ranch the same way a traveler studies unfamiliar land. The quiet stretched long enough that the sound of crickets filled the air. Then Jack pushed open the cabin door and walked inside. The lamp flickered to life a few seconds later, sending warm light through the dusty window. Still, the woman waited outside. She had seen enough settlements in her life to understand how captivity usually worked. Doors locked, windows barred, orders given in voices that carried impatience or fear. But none of those things happened. After a minute, the door opened again, and Jack stepped onto the porch holding a small tin bucket. He crossed the yard and placed it beside the water pump near the fence before returning to the steps. Only then did he finally look in her direction. The lantern light behind him revealed a face carved by sun and years of quiet labor. He spoke only 4 words. The first words he had offered since the trading yard. "Water is over there." His voice sounded rough but calm, the way wind sounds moving through dry canyon walls. He did not wait for an answer. Instead, he turned back toward the open cabin door and disappeared inside again. The Apache woman remained still for several seconds as the wind shifted across the valley. In all her years, she had never met a man who bought another human being and then walked away as if the matter no longer belonged to him. Slowly she moved toward the pump, filled the bucket, and drank. From the porch, the lamp inside the cabin burned steady against the dark horizon, while the desert stretched silent for miles in every direction. And somewhere in that quiet space, 2 strangers began the first night of a story neither of them yet understood. The road out of Red Hollow stretched 12 quiet miles before the desert finally swallowed every lantern glow behind them. And Jack Mercer rode ahead, without once turning his head, while the Apache woman walked beside his horse with the calm patience of someone who had spent a lifetime crossing wide land without asking permission from anyone. The wind moved slowly across the open country that night, brushing through dry grass and low sage as the moon climbed over the distant ridges. Jack kept his eyes forward, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other holding the reins loosely, while the steady rhythm of the horse filled the silence between them. Most men would have spoken by now. Most men would have tried to explain themselves, or ask questions, or offer some kind of reassurance. But Jack Mercer had forgotten how conversations were supposed to begin. 12 years of living alone had a way of sanding the edges off a man's voice until it felt strange in his own mouth. Back at the ranch, the cabin stood at the edge of a shallow valley surrounded by miles of open range. The place had been built long before Jack owned it, with rough pine beams, a stone chimney, and a porch that leaned slightly toward the west wind. The nearest town sat 30 miles away. The nearest neighbor was even farther. When storms rolled across the desert, they arrived without warning and left just as quickly, and most nights the only light came from the small oil lamp inside Jack's window. He had chosen the place because no one else wanted it. Or maybe because he believed no one else would come looking for him there. The horse slowed as the cabin appeared in the pale moonlight, its shadow stretching across the hard ground like an old memory. Jack dismounted, tied the reins to the rail beside the porch, and stepped toward the door without looking back. For a moment, the Apache woman remained near the gate, studying the ranch the same way a traveler studies unfamiliar land. The quiet stretched long enough that the sound of crickets filled the air. Then Jack pushed open the cabin door and walked inside. The lamp flickered to life a few seconds later, sending warm light through the dusty window. Still, the woman waited outside. She had seen enough settlements in her life to understand how captivity usually worked. Doors locked, windows barred, orders given in voices that carried impatience or fear. But none of those things happened. After a minute, the door opened again, and Jack stepped onto the porch holding a small tin bucket. He crossed the yard and placed it beside the water pump near the fence before returning to the steps. Only then did he finally look in her direction. The lantern light behind him revealed a face carved by sun and years of quiet labor. He spoke only 4 words, the first words he had offered since the trading yard. "Water is over there." His voice sounded rough but calm, the way wind sounds moving through dry canyon walls. He did not wait for an answer. Instead, he turned back toward the open cabin door and disappeared inside again. The Apache woman remained still for several seconds as the wind shifted across the valley. In all her years, she had never met a man who bought another human being and then walked away as if the matter no longer belonged to him. Slowly she moved toward the pump, filled the bucket, and drank. From the porch, the lamp inside the cabin burned steady against the dark horizon while the desert stretched silent for miles in every direction. And somewhere in that quiet space, 2 strangers began the first night of a story neither of them yet understood. The desert does not rush answers, and neither did the man who lived in the quiet cabin beneath the long Arizona sky. After speaking those few words about the rope, Jack Mercer turned away from the well and walked toward the barn with the slow, steady pace of someone who believed explanations were less important than actions. The Apache woman remained where she stood, watching him with the careful attention of someone who had learned long ago that silence often revealed more truth than questions. The sun continued climbing, warming the valley until the cool edge of morning faded into the dry breath of the day. From the barn came the sounds of simple work. Leather shifting, a saddle being lifted, the low rustle of hay. Nothing hurried, nothing forced. When Jack returned, he carried a bundle of tools and a small sack of grain, which he scattered near the fence where several chickens wandered through the dust. He moved through the ranch with quiet purpose, repairing a loose board along the corral and checking the water trough beside the pasture. Not once did he tell the woman what to do or where to stand. The ranch behaved as if she had always been there, another presence beneath the sky rather than something owned or controlled. She began to walk the edges of the property slowly, studying the land the same way a tracker studies a trail. The valley stretched almost 2 miles wide before rising toward a line of low hills where scrub trees twisted against the wind. Beyond those hills, the desert rolled for another 50 miles before touching the distant mountains. It was a place where a person could disappear simply by choosing a direction and continuing to walk. The thought crossed her mind more than once. She could leave before noon, and by nightfall the cowboy would be nothing more than a fading memory behind her. Yet something about the stillness of the ranch held her there. The gate remained open. The horse stood untethered near the shade of the barn. No one followed her steps. When she returned toward the cabin, Jack was seated on the porch sharpening a small knife against a whetstone with slow, patient strokes. The sound carried softly through the warm air. For several moments neither of them spoke. Then she noticed something hanging beside the cabin door that had escaped her attention the night before. It was a small piece of leather cord tied around a turquoise bead worn smooth by many years of handling. The object swayed gently in the breeze like a quiet memory. She stepped closer to examine it, and the moment her fingers brushed the bead, the cowboy looked up. The movement was small but deliberate, as if the object carried weight beyond its size. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Her voice was calm but different now, carrying the careful tone of someone who had just recognized a forgotten symbol. Jack rested the whetstone on his knee and glanced at the turquoise bead hanging beside the door. For a moment he did not answer. The wind drifted across the porch, carrying the distant sound of cattle grazing along the ridge. Finally he spoke. "Found it years ago," he said quietly. "A long time before this ranch belonged to me." The woman studied the bead again, her expression unreadable. Among her people, turquoise was not decoration. It was memory. It was promise. It was protection carried from one life into another. She turned back toward the cowboy and looked at him more closely than before, as if searching for something hidden beneath the years of dust and silence. "Someone gave this to you," she said. Jack Mercer did not respond immediately. His gaze drifted across the open valley while the bead continued to sway beside the door in the warm desert wind. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, the quiet space between them no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of a story that had started long before either of them realized it. The turquoise bead moved gently in the wind as the afternoon sun drifted across the valley, and the small piece of stone seemed far too quiet to carry the weight now resting between the two strangers standing on the porch. Jack Mercer watched it for a long moment before answering the woman's question, his eyes following the slow sway of the cord like a man remembering a trail he had not walked in many years. "It was given to me," he said finally, his voice steady but distant, as if the words were being lifted from somewhere deep inside the years behind him. The Apache woman stepped closer to the doorway and studied the bead more carefully, her fingers brushing the turquoise surface again with the familiarity of someone who understood its meaning long before she understood the man who carried it. Among her people, such stones were never handed out without reason. They were tokens of trust, pieces of memory that bound strangers together long after the moment had passed. She turned toward the cowboy again, her dark eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring the truth behind his quiet answer. "When?" she asked. Jack did not look at her immediately. Instead, he leaned back against the wooden porch rail and watched the cattle grazing along the ridge nearly half a mile away where the grass grew thicker after the spring rains. For several seconds, the only sound was the wind brushing through the valley and the faint creak of the hanging bead tapping against the cabin wall. 10 years ago, he said at last. The numbers settled into the air like dust after a long ride. The woman's gaze shifted from the bead to the cowboy's face as she studied the lines carved by sun and time across his expression. 10 years was not a small memory. 10 years meant the story had begun long before the trading yard and long before the rope that had bound her wrists. "Where?" she asked quietly. Jack let out a slow breath through his nose and glanced toward the distant hills to the south where the land dipped into a narrow canyon filled with pale cottonwood trees. Even from the ranch, the canyon could be seen cutting through the desert like a thin scar across the earth. "Near the dry river canyon," he said. "During a storm that should have killed me." The woman's expression changed almost too slightly to notice. Dry River Canyon lay nearly 30 miles from the ranch and far beyond the roads most traders used when traveling between towns. It was a place known among the Apache for sudden winds and narrow paths where horses often lost their footing if the rider was careless or unlucky. Jack continued speaking slowly, as if the memory itself required careful steps. "My horse slipped along the canyon trail," he said. "The storm rolled in fast. I broke my leg and could not ride out before the rain came." He paused for a moment, remembering the cold weight of that night and the dark sky pouring water into the canyon like an endless river. "I thought I would die there," he finished quietly. The woman's eyes returned to the turquoise bead swaying beside the door. The wind lifted it again, and the stone caught the late afternoon light in a soft blue reflection. Among her people, a bead like that was often given to someone whose life had been spared when the spirits had every reason to take it. She looked back at Jack Mercer slowly, the calm strength in her gaze returning with a new understanding forming behind it. "Someone found you," she said. The cowboy nodded once. "Yes," he answered. "Someone did." The valley grew quiet again as the sun lowered toward the western hills, and the turquoise bead continued its gentle movement in the wind, carrying with it the silent proof that the story tying these two strangers together had begun long before either of them realized it. The wind shifted as the sun slipped lower across the Arizona sky, and the valley carried that quiet golden light that only appears during the last hour before evening settles over the land. Jack Mercer remained leaning against the porch rail while the turquoise bead continued to sway beside the door, and the woman watched him with the calm patience of someone who understood that stories spoken slowly were often the ones that mattered most. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The desert had a way of stretching silence until it felt almost alive. Finally, Jack stepped off the porch and walked a few paces into the yard, his boots pressing soft marks into the dust that had settled there for years. He looked toward the southern hills again, where Dry River Canyon cut through the earth like a narrow path carved by time itself. "I do not remember much from that night," he said quietly. The rain was heavy. The canyon filled with water faster than a man could walk out. The woman listened without interrupting. The sky above them had begun to fade from bright blue into deeper shades of amber and copper. Jack continued speaking with the same steady tone he used when guiding cattle through the valley. I remember waking beside a fire, he said. Someone had carried me from the canyon and wrapped my leg with cloth and splints. He paused for a moment, as if searching the memory for details that had grown faint after so many years. It was an older Apache woman, he added. She stayed beside me for 2 days while the storm passed. The woman standing near the door felt a quiet weight settle in her chest. The wind lifted the turquoise bead again, turning it gently so the stone caught the fading sunlight. Jack glanced at it once before continuing. She spoke little English, he said, but she made sure I could stand again before she left. The memory seemed almost peaceful as he described it, like a distant moment preserved in clear desert air. Before she walked away, she placed that bead in my hand, he said, nodding toward the door. She said it would remind me that the desert does not take every man it could. The Apache woman closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, the calm strength in her expression had deepened into something quieter and more certain. She stepped forward slowly until she stood only a few feet from the cowboy. The woman who helped you, she said softly. Did she have silver in her hair and a small scar beside her left eye? Jack turned his head toward her in mild surprise. Yes, he answered after a moment. The woman looked once more at the turquoise bead swaying in the wind. Among her people, that description belonged to only one person, a healer known for traveling the southern valleys when storms trapped travelers in dangerous places. She lifted her gaze back to Jack Mercer, and the last rays of sunlight touched her face as evening began to settle across the ranch. She was my grandmother, the Apache woman said quietly. The words rested between them like a stone placed carefully into clear water. Jack Mercer did not move for several seconds. The valley grew still again as the sun disappeared behind the western hills and the sky deepened into twilight. The turquoise bead continued its gentle motion beside the cabin door, carrying the silent proof that the man, who believed he had once been saved by a stranger, was now standing in the presence of the family that had changed the course of his life. The evening air settled gently across the ranch after the woman spoke those quiet words, and for a long moment Jack Mercer simply stood there as if the desert itself had shifted beneath his boots. The last light of the sun had faded behind the western hills, leaving a deep violet sky stretching across the valley while the first stars appeared one by one above the silent land. The turquoise bead beside the door continued its slow motion in the breeze, tapping softly against the cabin wall as though it too had been waiting many years to hear the truth that now hung between them. Jack looked from the bead to the woman and back again, the calm strength in her eyes reflecting the same quiet certainty carried by the stone that had once been placed in his hand during the storm at Dry River Canyon. For 12 years he had believed the woman who saved his life had simply vanished into the desert like a passing shadow, yet now the story had returned and was standing only a few feet away beneath the fading light. Your grandmother, he said slowly, testing the words as if they belonged to someone else's memory. The Apache woman nodded once. Her name was Talani, she answered. She was the healer for our people for many years. Jack lowered his gaze toward the dusty ground of the porch while the wind moved gently through the valley. The name felt familiar in a distant way, like the echo of a voice heard long ago during a night filled with thunder and rain. She never told me her name, he said quietly, but she stayed beside me until I could walk again. The woman stepped closer to the hanging bead and held it still between her fingers so it no longer tapped against the wood. The small stone rested in her palm like a memory returning home. She spoke of a cowboy once, she said after a moment. A quiet man she found injured in the canyon during a storm. Jack raised his eyes again. The desert wind carried the distant call of a night bird across the valley while the sky deepened into full darkness above them. She said the man thanked her but did not ask for anything more. The woman continued. That was why she left him the turquoise stone. Jack listened without interrupting. The ranch had never felt smaller than it did in that moment, as if the years between that storm and this quiet evening had suddenly folded together into a single point in time. The woman released the bead, and it began swaying again in the wind. Among our people, she said softly, a gift like that is given to someone who is trusted to carry the memory forward. Jack turned slightly and looked out across the open valley where the cattle now stood as dark shapes beneath the starlit sky. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the hills. Just as it had the night, he believed he would never leave the canyon alive. After several seconds he spoke again, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I always wondered if I would see her again," he admitted. The woman studied him for a moment before answering. "You did," she said gently. "Through me." The wind moved across the ranch once more, brushing the dry grass and lifting the turquoise bead into another slow circle beneath the porch light. And in that quiet moment both of them understood that the story between them had never truly been about a man buying a stranger in a distant town, but about a promise made many years earlier in a storm-filled canyon that had finally found its way back to the place where it belonged. The night settled deep across the valley after their conversation, and the ranch grew quiet beneath a sky filled with cold, bright stars. The wind moved slowly across the open land, carrying the dry scent of sage and distant dust, while the cattle shifted softly along the ridge nearly half a mile away. Jack Mercer sat on the edge of the porch steps with his hat resting beside him, staring out over the dark valley, as if the land itself might answer the questions that had followed him through the years. The Apache woman remained standing near the doorway where the turquoise bead continued its gentle movement in the breeze, tapping softly against the wood like a quiet heartbeat. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The desert did not rush such moments. Finally, the woman stepped down from the porch and walked a few paces into the yard, her eyes scanning the horizon beyond the southern hills. Something in the air had changed. It was subtle at first, almost too small to notice, but the land carried messages for those who knew how to listen. The wind shifted direction and brought with it a faint disturbance in the distance. Jack noticed the movement a moment later when his horse lifted its head near the barn and gave a low, restless sound through its nose. The cowboy rose slowly and walked toward the edge of the yard beside the fence. He looked out across the dark valley where the moonlight brushed the tops of the distant hills. At first there was nothing. Then he saw it. A thin ribbon of dust rising along the far trail that led toward Red Hollow. Even in the dim light, it was clear the dust was not drifting naturally across the ground. It moved in a steady line as if carried by riders approaching from the distant road. The Apache woman followed his gaze, and the calm strength in her expression tightened slightly as she watched the horizon. "They found the trail," she said quietly. Jack glanced toward her. "Who?" he asked. The woman kept her eyes on the rising dust in the distance. "The traders," she answered. "The men who brought me to the yard." The cowboy stood still for a moment, studying the slow movement across the valley. The riders were still far away, at least 2 miles from the ranch, but the desert carried sound and movement clearly beneath the moon. Whoever they were traveling directly toward the cabin. Jack rested his hand against the wooden fence rail and looked again at the turquoise bead hanging beside the door behind him. The small stone turned slowly in the wind, as if reminding him of something older than the approaching riders and older than the long silence he had lived with for so many years. "How many?" he asked calmly. The woman studied the dust cloud carefully before answering. "For riders," she said. Jack nodded once. The number did not seem to trouble him. The ranch had stood alone for a long time, and the desert had taught him that fear often arrived faster than reason. He turned back toward the cabin and walked to the porch where the lantern still burned beside the doorway. For a moment, he looked at the turquoise bead swaying gently in the light. Then he lifted the lantern and carried it down the steps into the yard. The warm glow stretched across the dust as he placed the lantern on the fence post beside the gate. The Apache woman watched him with quiet curiosity. "Why there?" she asked. Jack glanced toward the distant riders again, their approach now clearer beneath the moonlit sky. "Because when they arrive," he said calmly, "they will see this ranch is not hiding from them." The wind moved through the valley once more as the dust cloud slowly grew closer along the trail, and beneath the steady lantern light, the lonely ranch waited in silence, while the past finally rode back across the desert to meet the man who had never expected it to return. The riders reached the valley long after the moon had climbed high enough to wash the desert in pale silver light, and the thin ribbon of dust that once trailed behind them finally settled across the trail leading to the ranch gate. Jack Mercer stood beside the lantern he had placed on the fence post, the warm glow stretching across the ground while the wind brushed slowly through the tall dry grass beyond the pasture. The Apache woman remained near the porch steps, her eyes steady as she watched the approaching figures ride closer through the quiet night. For horses moved across the open land with the unhurried confidence of men who believed the desert belonged to them. Their shadows stretched long across the valley floor until they finally reached the gate where the lantern light revealed their faces clearly. The man in front pulled his horse to a stop and studied the ranch with a narrow stare, his hat casting a deep shadow across his brow. "Well now," he said after a moment, glancing toward Jack. "Seems the quiet cowboy did not ride far after all." Jack Mercer rested one hand on the wooden fence rail and looked calmly at the riders without moving from his place beside the lantern. The wind shifted again across the valley, carrying the distant sound of cattle moving along the ridge behind the barn. "Evening," he said simply. The man at the front of the group leaned forward slightly in his saddle, his eyes drifting toward the porch, where the Apache woman stood in the soft lantern light. "You bought something in Red Hollow yesterday," he said slowly. "Something that was not meant to stay gone." The cowboy followed the direction of the man's gaze, but did not step aside. For a moment the valley seemed to hold its breath beneath the moonlit sky. The Apache woman walked forward from the porch and stopped beside the gate, her presence calm and steady beside the quiet cowboy. She looked directly at the men who had once brought her to the trading yard, and her voice carried clearly through the still night air. "You came too late," she said. The riders exchanged brief glances with one another. The man in front shifted slightly in his saddle before answering. "Late?" he repeated with a small smile. "We only came to collect what belongs to us." The woman lifted her chin slightly, and the lantern light revealed the quiet strength in her eyes. "No one belongs to you," she replied. The wind lifted the turquoise bead hanging beside the cabin door, and it turned gently in the breeze behind them. Jack Mercer glanced back toward it for just a moment before returning his gaze to the riders at the gate. The leader followed his glance and noticed the bead swaying beside the doorway. Something in his expression changed slightly as he studied the small piece of stone glowing faintly in the lantern light. "That is an Apache stone," he muttered under his breath. The woman stepped closer to the fence beside Jack Mercer and placed her hand lightly against the wooden rail. "My grandmother gave that stone to the man who survived the storm in Dry River Canyon," she said calmly. The riders looked between the woman and the cowboy with growing uncertainty. Jack Mercer did not raise his voice or move from his place beside the lantern. He simply stood there beneath the wide desert sky as the wind moved softly through the valley. The leader of the riders looked once more at the turquoise bead, then back at the quiet rancher who had never tried to hide the light of his lantern. After a long moment, the man slowly turned his horse away from the gate. "Come on," he said to the others. The riders pulled their horses around one by one and began moving back along the trail they had followed into the valley. The dust rose briefly beneath the hooves before fading again into the night air. Jack Mercer remained beside the lantern until the riders disappeared beyond the distant hills. Only then did he turn toward the porch where the turquoise bead still moved gently in the wind. The Apache woman looked at him for a moment before speaking softly. "You did not buy me," she said. Jack glanced once more at the open valley stretching beyond the ranch before answering in the same quiet voice that had carried him through years of silence. "No," he said calmly. "But your grandmother once gave me something far more valuable." The lantern light flickered softly beside the gate, while the desert wind carried the sound of distant horses fading into the night. And beneath the endless sky the lonely ranch no longer felt quite as empty as it had the day before.